As the early light of 2021 begins to dawn over us all, sweeping away the memories of recent festivities, one could be forgiven for thinking that it's time to look forward to what the promise or problems might await over the coming 12 months. Well, that might be true, but I think it's prudent for us to cast our minds back to some of the main developments that were witnessed in the Indo-Pacific in 2020, given the geopolitical gravity well shifting inexorably that way. And I can think of no better qualified individual to lead us through this look back, to refresh, to remind, than Shephard's Asia-Pacific editor, Gordon Arthur. Gordon, welcome back to this, the 52nd episode of the second season of the Weekly Defence Podcast.
Thank you, Richard, and season's greetings to you.
Thank you very much. So let's get into it. I think we're going to go, well, I know where we're going to go first. So even while dealing with a pandemic, quashing a pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong and putting up giant nothing to see here posters on the fences and walls of Uyghur internment camps, China still found time to nearly go to war with India along its disputed border. So what went on?
Yeah, I mean, for me, Richard, this was one of the top defence stories from the region. And just looking back, it was a pretty momentous occasion. So we had Chinese and Indian troops engaged in brutal hand-to-hand fighting up in the Himalayas. So we still don't know how many Chinese soldiers died. We know 20 Indians lost their lives in the combat. And I mean, this was obviously the most serious conflict along that border for decades. And so looking back, it hasn't grown, or it hasn't lessened, I think, in its dramatic impact. And probably the most important thing to come out of it is that nothing has been resolved. So, I mean, I think to date, around about 8 different sessions of negotiations have occurred between high-ranking military officials on both sides, and absolutely nothing has been achieved. So, to me, it's a typical Chinese delaying tactic, trying to create new conditions on the ground. Of course, at this time of year, it's high winter up in those mountains. It's freezing cold. It's snowy. Perhaps the Indians are better equipped for those kind of conditions, but the Chinese have showed absolutely no sign of pulling back. And not only that, what has been interesting is the amount of infrastructure and support materials that have been established along the border. So we can see from satellite imagery, for example, a number of new helipads or heliports being built. We have ammunition dumps, new roads, and concentrations of troops are still there. New barracks being built for the PLA and for the border regiments. So, yeah, it certainly hasn't been resolved, and it shows no sign of being resolved.
I mean, conflicts are always an opportunity to test new equipment or new tactics. I think this was certainly the case for China, wasn't it?
Yeah, and we did talk in a previous episode last year about China's alleged use of microwave weapons. So, I mean, China's obviously not going to give us any convenient confirmation that it did so. But certainly we have people in China who have said that it did occur and that China used microwave weapons to remove Indian troops from the top of hilltops. So this was near Lake Pangong. This is one area where Chinese troops had moved into territory it previously didn't occupy and who have refused to pull back. So, yeah, if that did happen, the use of such weapons was certainly an intensification. Of course, it's better than shooting people dead with guns and bullets, but still, it's an act of war.
So, at the end of all the toing and froing and the conflict, did anyone gain anything from it? Was any land exchanged?
You'd have to say that China has come out top, because it's moved forward into areas that it had never occupied before. So often, I mean, that border is undemarcated and for large areas, and both sides claim particular lines or areas that they patrol up to. But China has certainly moved forward and gained kilometers of new territory and has refused to pull back. So I think China has gained a slight tactical advantage, but then at the same time, you'd have to say strategically that India, has really dug in its heels. It's not giving up territory lightly. It's sometimes it's gone on the offensive and been a bit more proactive than it has been in the past. I think it will force China to think again. What its next moves will be? So it was good. I think India, it had to show a stiff backbone against Chinese aggression, and it has done so.
Good stuff. And in October, you provided a fascinating insight into North Korea's military capabilities, which were seen during a nighttime parade in Pyongyang, I think. So what caught your attention for that story?
Yeah, it would have been lovely to be there, wouldn't it? But that's the Hermit Kingdom, and it's not easy to get in, and it's certainly not easy to get out, let alone without COVID-19. But I did watch the video of the parade from start to finish, and it was impressive. Over recent months and years, we've had lots of hullabaloo about rapprochement between the US and North Korea and President Trump and Kim Jong-un, sort of this emerging friendship. But what we've discovered that it is basically led nowhere. North Korea is investing heavily in new weapons, and a lot of these did appear in that particular parade. So I think one of the most impressive in this 10th October parade was the revelation of the Hwasong 16 intercontinental ballistic missile. Of course, details are a bit sparse, but possibly its launch mass something around about 120 to 125 tons. It's estimated it could deliver a 2-ton to 3.5-ton nuclear warhead to any location in the continental USA. So I think that gives Washington something to think about. So absolutely no sign that North Korea wants to give up its nuclear intentions. And not only that, it's also seeking to put submarine-launched ballistic missiles into service as well. So, yeah, a lot of scary things going on in North Korea as well.
How viable? I mean, it's a hypothetical, I suppose, because there's no way for us to verify it. But I'll ask you anyway, because I'll put you on the spot. How do you think these capabilities are viable? The ICBM and the ballistic missiles for the submarines, are these missiles that could be used, or are they just paper tigers?
It's a good question, and I don't consider myself to be an expert on North Korean capabilities, but I think it's proved that it has developed nuclear warheads. It's shown on numerous occasions that it can fire ballistic missiles. Some of them are more reliable than others, but of course it only takes one nuclear tipped missile to reach its target, and that would be pretty disastrous. So, yeah, nuclear weapons certainly a scary prospect in the hands of Kim Jong-un and his military regime. But I think more than that too was just the sheer quantity of conventional weapons, especially in terms of artillery and rockets. So, yeah, just an incredible amount of new systems that were appearing. So we had multiple rocket launches of 240 millimeter caliber, 600 millimeter caliber. I mean, these are huge artillery systems, new kind of trucks, some on tracks. So, I mean, these kinds of equipment, they can rain down a barrage of high explosive on South Korea. So, yeah, North Korea, not one to be taken lightly.
Indeed. In the article, you made mention of some armoured vehicles that bore resemblance to sort of Russian or US platforms. Now, do you think these are just sort of copycats or simulacrums? Or does it point to a North Korean industrial capability that's improving in what it can turn out?
I think most people were quite surprised with all the new things that North Korea unveiled. And it seemed to indicate that North Korea has sort of re-intensified its research and development and introducing new kinds of weapons. I mean, you talked about new ones, and certainly there was one that looked very similar to a Russian T-14 Armata main battle tank. There was a series of 8x8 armored vehicles that looked very similar to the US Stryker family. Lots. They also had 8x8 trucks that looked very similar to the US Oshkosh Hemet trucks. I'm sure there are other countries that are supplying chassis or different bits of equipment, but certainly North Korea has the ability to put them together and to create new weapons. I think, there's been nothing achieved in any kind of decline in North Korean efforts.
Okay, well, let's look to Indonesia, which kept everyone guessing in 2020 with its defence acquisitions. I looked at it a little bit myself. On the naval side, it was certainly shopping around here, there, and everywhere looking for platforms. Is there method to this madness, or is it just a lack of direction?
Yeah, it was a case of Christmas shopping for Indonesia. And I would say, there was very little method, and it was just mostly madness. So earlier last year, we had Indonesia. It was approved to buy 8 Ospreys from the US. And given the budget of the Indonesian military, I think this was a very unlikely acquisition that it was ever going to take place. And to add interest to the whole thing, the MOD started to backtrack and say that it didn't really want to buy these at all. So lots of confusion reigning there in the corridors of the MOD in Jakarta. So more than the Ospreys, we also had Indonesia expressing keen interest in buying 15 second-hand Typhoon fighters from Austria. The Indonesian Air Force, it operates a number of different types of aircraft. It has F-16s from the US, it has Su-27s and Su-30s from Russia, and a few other different things. So certainly it hasn't got an up-to-date European fighter, so that seemed to be on its radar. And not only that, South Korea is developing the KFX fighter, and Indonesia is a financial investor in that particular program, although we hear that it's way behind in its scheduled payments for that program. So perhaps at some point Seoul will actually decide to kick it out. Who knows? But that wasn't all, Richard, because just last month in December, we had new reports appearing. So we find out that Indonesia is actually negotiating with France to buy 48 Rafale fighters. It hasn't got any of those yet, so they would be a nice addition to the Indonesian collection. And further than that, the USA has actually approved the sale of F-15s or Super Hornets to Indonesia. Apparently, it was interested in the F-35, but the USA wasn't prepared to sell that, but it is prepared to sell F-15s and F-18s. So we have a real hodgepodge of equipment and acquisitions, and it just seems Indonesia, anything that tickles its fancy, it sends out an inquiry, or media goes crazy and says Indonesia is going to be buying this or that. So what will Indonesia actually end up with? We don't know. It was supposed to be buying Su-35s from Russia, but it seems that's been held up by the threat of US sanctions if it did proceed and go ahead and buy those from the Russian manufacturer. And as you said, certainly the naval side, there was different interest as well. So there's reports that it would like to buy a couple of frigates from Denmark. There was also talk that it was going to buy a surplus second-hand frigate from Germany. Even more recently, Japan has launched a new class of frigate, and Indonesia is particularly excited about that, and it would like to buy some of those and perhaps build some in Indonesia as well. So a real interesting one, Richard. Normally, I'm very critical of India for its defence procurements and acquisitions because they're so muddled. But really, for 2020, Indonesia takes the cake.
Fascinating that. I mean, what about Indonesian industry, though? It sounds like that Indonesia is fixated on the idea of purchasing platforms from overseas, which is a fairly expensive way to do it, but fair enough. But what about the local industry? Are there any easy wins that can be had there to kind of help them?
Yeah, I mean, Indonesia does have a significant domestic capability. So in terms of aircraft, we have PDTI, which is a state-owned company. So they assemble helicopters. So they have different cooperative agreements with BAO and Airbus, for example. So they assemble or fit out helicopters for the military. They also produce fixed-wing aircraft. They've had sales to countries like the Philippines and Vietnam. Also, the CN-235 is assembled there. We also have PT PAO, shipbuilder. So they've produced LPDs for the Philippines. The one big program they have at the moment is submarines. So they've had 3 ordered from South Korea. I think 2 are in service yet. The third one, not quite. And then the Indonesians actually ordered a second batch of 3 submarines from Daewoo Shipbuilding in South Korea. But another interesting story to add to the Indonesian drama, it seems Indonesia may be trying to wriggle out of that particular contract. There's reports that it's now interested in perhaps French submarines or submarines from somewhere else. So, yeah, it's sort of like a never-ending circle, really. It pursues one thing and then loses interest and goes after something else.
Okay, well, leaving Indonesia behind, as much as it pains me to do so, because that was really good fun, let's move to another growing military force in the region, and we have Australia. And, of course, it's busy with frigates, with submarines, IFVs and all the rest of it, but you wanted to highlight specifically its Loyal Wingman program, so all yours.
Yeah, I mean, for the size of the country, I mean, Australia is sort of a medium country, but it has a very highly capable military and very advanced. A lot of that is related to its relationship with the US because they are particularly close. And just recently, actually, they announced a cooperative agreement regarding hypersonics. So the US and Australia together will develop a new hypersonic missiles for their respective forces. But you're right, the Loyal Wingman, that's another interesting one. And this is being headed by Boeing Australia, obviously at the behest of the Australian military. So we had, and I think we talked about this back in September, we had the first ground engine tests of the Loyal Wingman, which is an unmanned aircraft designed to accompany fighters and perform different missions. And later on, we had low-speed taxi tests. As far as we know, it hasn't sort of got off the ground yet in its maiden flight. But there were reports that it was supposed to happen before the end of 2020. So perhaps news about that will emerge in due course. So the Loyal Wingman, we know it's 11.7 meters long, has a wingspan of 7.3 meters, a range exceeding 2,000 nautical miles, and quite a stealthy sort of cross-section. And the whole aim, I think, is to create this sort of manned-unmanned teaming effect where such a UAV is cheaper to produce. It doesn't put highly trained pilots in harm's way. And perhaps 4 to 6 of these Loyal Wingmen can accompany a fighter on a particular mission. They can carry weapons, they can serve as decoys, they can jam radars, gather intelligence, perform ISR, etc., etc. So, yeah, I think that's one program to watch. And China, we know, is doing something similar with the Loyal Wingman program. Of course, that's shrouded in secrecy. But apart from that, I think in all of Asia Pacific, Australia is probably the country furthest ahead. I think there were reports that Japan is also looking at that kind of technology. But yeah, one to watch.
We'll have to leave it there for now. To our listeners, if you want to check out all the stories we've just talked about, please visit the Shephard Media website. Quick final thanks to Gordon Arthur, Asia Pacific editor. Gordon, catch you in a few weeks.
Thanks so much, Richard.
Coming up next is Noemi Di Stefano, multimedia journalist, in conversation with training and simulation editor Trevor Nash.
Their goal is to win without going to war, to achieve their objectives by breaking our willpower, using attacks below the threshold that would prompt a warfighting response. These attacks on our way of life from authoritarian rivals and extremist ideologies are remarkably difficult to defeat without undermining the very freedoms we want to protect. We are exposed through our openness.
This is General Sir Nick Carter, head of the UK Armed Forces. Speaking at the Policy Exchange think tank, General Carter sounded a grave warning. The UK and its allies are operating in a rapidly changing world. And while a focus on counterinsurgency operations may have dominated the early years of the century, attention has now shifted to the threat posed by China and Russia.
Their way of warfare is strategic. It is synchronized and it is systematic, and our response must be too.
This is Shephard Studios' podcast series on Five Eyes connectivity, sponsored by our partner, Viasat. In this second series, we're exploring the military connectivity issues facing the Five Eyes nations and looking at the work underway to ensure communication networks can withstand the expected threats of tomorrow. In this episode, we focus on the UK and hear how a rapidly shifting threat environment is driving a transformation of British military capabilities. As General Carter puts it, the British military is moving from an industrial age of platforms to an information age of systems. The Five Eyes Connectivity podcast was created by Shephard Studio in partnership with our sponsor, Viasat. To learn more about Viasat's support to the Five Eyes nations, visit fiveeyesconnect.com for capability profiles, white papers, videos, and more. Until next time.
Hello and welcome to another segment of the Weekly Defence podcast dedicated to all the news from the military simulation and training sphere. I'm Noemi Di Stefano, multimedia journalist here at Shephard Media, and from me and the rest of the team at Shephard, we hope you had a very happy new year, and I'm sure you are all keen as we are in getting stuck into what 2021 has in store. As we want to take a look at some of the highlights from 2020 on military and simulation training programs, markets, and new technology trends, it's time to welcome to the show our military training editor, Trevor Nash. Hi, Trevor. How are you doing?
Naomi, I'm very well, thank you very much. And I do hope you had a good new year.
Yes. What do you think? What vibe do you get, Trevor, about this 2021? Do you think it's going to be better?
I think it is. It's got to be better. You know, coming out with this, vaccine now for everybody. I think it's got to be a much more positive year than the last one we've just been.
Let's hope so. And as we wait and see what happens next, I just wanted to take a look at the past 12 months, Trevor, and I wanted to ask you a question that I've been asking to everyone, to all the domain editors, to all the reporters. So if we take a look back at the beginning of 2020, before the pandemic started, and then we look at where we are now, would you say that COVID-19 has turned the tables for the military training sector in terms of programs and market in general?
That's a good question, Naomi, because when we were hit with COVID back in February 2020, there was definitely a mood of doom and gloom. But I think that has been reappraised, that situation, and people are now taking a far more pragmatic approach. To give you an example, that initial period, it prevented people from traveling and seeing customers around the world. It prevented people working in their factories to produce the equipment that was already on order. And so the end result of that there was a dip in the production of the training and simulation equipment. There was also a dip in the way that companies offered training services out to the military customers. So there was certainly a dip. However, the brilliant thing about our industry is that once we realized the issues that were there, some very clever people decided to get around those issues. And that is the thing that's impressed me most about the simulation and training industry in 2020 was their ability to reevaluate the situation and look at ways to get around the issues, get around the problems, and deliver to the customers.
So would you say that the industry has then held out somehow?
I would do to an extent. Clearly, there are issues because COVID has cost the global community a great deal of money, and that money has got to be found from somewhere. And obviously, defence is, generally speaking, an easy target to reduce budgets. That said, some countries, notably the UK, has increased its defence spending, which was announced in 2020. And so I think that there are situations now where we are beginning to move forward with procurements. Let's not forget, in the US, there are some major programs underway over there. The synthetic training environment still progresses. The replacement for I-Miles is still a current program. And there again, in Europe, we also have programs there, as well as in North America, Canada in particular. And I'm referring there to the Future Aircrew Training System. You know, there have been casualties. For instance, Meggitt decided last year to divest itself of Meggitt Training Systems. That program was bought by investors, is now known as Inveris. But generally speaking, I'm quite positive for this, coming year.
And what are the current programs? What does the market look like at this time?
Well, I mentioned the US Army's synthetic training environment, STE. That's progressing incredibly well. I mentioned the I-Miles replacement. That's early stages, although some minor contracts have been placed for that. And that eventually, over time, not only with the US customers, particularly the Army and US Marine Corps, but the number of foreign military sales requirements for that particular system, that's going to go into the billions. We mentioned in Europe programs we've got in the NATO Flight Training Centre that they're hoping to open in Greece. This particular program is ongoing. One of the partners in that particular program, although it's early stage, is Airbus Defence and Space. They've ended up designing a new advanced jet training aircraft, ostensibly for use by the Spanish Air Force to replace their Casa 101 and F5 jet training aircraft. However, the opportunity for that aeroplane to be pushed into this NATO Flight Training Europe program is particularly strong. So, we've got that program coming down the lines. Future Aircrew Training System in Canada, that's another one. And then, of course, like STE and I-Miles replacement, we've got the massive T-7A program in the United States. That now is progressing incredibly well. I think the first aircraft coming into service for initial operating capability is in 2023. But the ground-based training system for that is now being built, and that includes, participation from a number of major companies. Diamond Visionics, for example, for the image generators, JVC supplying projectors, Wittgenstein for control loading, and ACME for the simulated ejection seats. So, there's a lot going on. I would say, coming back to your earlier point about the general market, it was a pity, obviously, last year, though fully understandable, that ITEC and ITSEC was cancelled, the two major shows for our community, where the S&T industry shows off its wares to the world and acts as a fantastic meeting place. ITSEC in particular, which happened at the end of 2020, they had a virtual version of that, and it worked incredibly well, I thought. And so if, for example, we're still in the situation that ITEC can't take place next year in Spain, we could obviously go for a virtual version of that again to emulate what was done at ITSEC.
And I wanted to ask you, for those listeners who have missed the webinar, which went live at the end of December, I know you talked about ITSEC in that with our news editor, Ben Vogel. So what impressions did you get from the virtual ITSEC, and how was it? What capabilities were on display? What were the highlights from that event?
Well, to not go there was a great disappointment. However, it did give me the opportunity to look at the program, select the conference papers I wanted to listen to, and that could be done with a great deal of ease. A lot of those presentations were recorded, so if I missed the late afternoon UK evening time paper, I could then listen to it again because it was recorded. That was marvelous. The thing that was missing, obviously, from it is that if you're there, in the evenings, you can grab a drink, bump into somebody fortuitously and discuss certain programs. So that networking element was missing. But that said, it was still a very good event. In terms of the highlights, I mean, it's difficult to say, but I would really focus on virtual display systems there. Collins Aerospace was pushing its Griffin 2, although that was actually launched last year. This latest iteration of Griffin 2 was very interesting. And it also launched the Panorama Highlight display. The Finnish head-mounted display company, Varjo, were there with their VR3 and XR3 head-mounted displays. And CAE, of course, with their Medallion MR series. It's a very interesting system. We've written about it already on our news website, where we've looked at how it's been sold to Qatar and also the Royal Air Force for use on Eurofighter programs. So, yeah, I guess, in terms of the technologies, it's always the displays that interest me the most.
Yeah, and as you said, you wrote a lot of stories from HSEC, and I would encourage our listeners to go and check those on our website, shepherdmedia.com/news. And Trevor, let's now move to the next topic, and let's talk about adversary combat training. So what is it?
2020, Naomi, I think was a massive year for Adversary Air. Adversary Air basically is the ability to put aircraft into the air that can compete against friendly aircraft. So the Adversary Air, or Red Air as it's sometimes known, emulate the tactics, techniques and procedures of a potential enemy. Historically, the US Air Force, US Navy have generated squadrons to do it themselves. Due to defense realignment and budget cuts over the years, the number of units doing this Red Air themselves is reduced, and it's moved now to a service provision concept whereby industry do it. There are probably around the world a dozen or so companies that undertake this particular type of training, this training service. And in the US, we have just come to the end of the selection process. And although things are being delivered, but we've got a window which is worth around about 6.4 billion over the next 10 years, where certain companies have been selected to provide this training for the US Air Force under a program called the Combat Air Forces Contracted Air Support, or CAFCAS.
And I was going to ask, which companies are involved in this program?
Well, there are numerous companies. ATAC is probably the biggest player in this area at the moment for CAFCAS. ATAC owned by Textron Systems. They use a company called Valkyrie Aerospace, and Valkyrie Aero look after the close air support element of the CAFCAS program itself. And then we have Draken International, another major player in that area. And then Top Aces, another company. Those are the three largest ones. But as I say, there are probably about a dozen companies around the world that provide that service.
So why is adversary air combat training important for the US Army?
I think the major reason is it's a major element of live training. So pilots and aircrew in general can train in the virtual simulator. They can also train against adversaries in that simulator. The problem with flight simulators is you're not actually pulling G. You're under no physiological or psychological stress in the simulator, although it's still obviously clearly a brilliant training tool. The way then to get out and carry out live training after you've undertaken virtual training in the simulator enables you to carry out that live training with the impact of real flight conditions.
Are there any potential flaws to these programs? Are there any issues to this program?
When you've got complex aircraft, fifth generation aircraft like the F-35 and the F-22, it is very difficult to put another aircraft up unless it's an F-35 or an F-22 to challenge those types of aircraft. Now, some pilots will say to me, that doesn't matter because you're engaging aircraft beyond visual range. But we don't know what we don't know. So we don't know the capabilities of any Chinese stealth aircraft or indeed Russian stealth aircraft, which we haven't seen yet. So there is a little bit of a potential training gap that is or could be there at the moment. Now, a lot of these adversary companies, the Red Air companies, are buying fourth generation aeroplanes and updating them. For instance, Draken and ATAC have bought Mirage F1s from the French and Spanish air forces. There's a rumor going around at the moment which one company is procuring F-16s. But there again, does a Mirage F1 and an F-16 really stack up against an F-35? We don't know. There are other companies that say to me, well, it needs to be a balance between the live aircraft and also using visual embedded training systems within the aircraft to, replicate other aircraft.
Okay. And while obviously live adversary air training remains important, there is a growing role for simulated and virtual solutions in the industry at the moment. And obviously the industry is looking to introduce AI into training more and more. And you have reported extensively last year on the advances of artificial intelligence. So I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit more about some of the main programs which are focusing on bringing AI into training.
Yeah, I seem to have spoken a lot about AI, but it is important. It is coming into virtual simulation more and more. We saw the United States DARPA organization running its Alpha Dogfight program, 2019-2020. And that was really looking at how they could gain insights into the use of artificial intelligence in the training environment. And that was very successful. It drew together around 10 companies that were involved in that program, and it completed the exercise, the evaluation, by using an AI pilot versus real pilots, and the AI pilot won every time. AI is important, especially when we look at the what was called Pilot Training Next program. It's now referred to as UPT 2.5 or Undergraduate Pilot Training 2.5. And that basically is trying to get pilots to their squadrons quicker. In other words, shortening the training time. And it's been referred to as data-driven learning, where artificial intelligence is used to evaluate how people learn and then use those lessons to tailor the training to that specific pilot. And it's interesting to note that the United States Air Force have already taken pilots off the T6 aeroplane, which is the initial used for initial training. And instead of putting them then onto the T-38 for the advanced jet training, they've taken them straight from the T6 straight into the F-35. And according to Lockheed Martin, there is completely no difference between the quality standard of pilots coming from the T6 into the F-35 compared to those coming off the T-38 into the F-35. So that tells you the capabilities of UPT 2.5 and indeed the use of AI in this data-driven learning environment. It seems to be very, very successful.
And of course, we have talked about simulators, and there are a lot of simulators put out there by different companies. But how does it work? Are these simulators able to talk to each other? Are there any standards that these simulators are built to?
People have been talking about standards in simulation for 40 years. The US, like most things in simulation, are leading the charge. They're at the vanguard of this, and they always have been. Kicking off with a program in the late 80s called SimNet, Simulation Network. They looked at linking simulators together. And before you can link simulators together, you've got to have a common architecture or common protocol to enable them to talk to each other. From dear old SimNet, we moved into what's called distributed mission operations, where the simulators could be, and in fact are today, linked together. So we have the US combat air forces that can link F-16, F-15. In 2020, there was an exercise where the F-35 was linked for the first time along with the F-22. They link up with AWACS aircraft, E-3 aircraft. So it is happening. The US Air Force want to go a stage further, and they've implemented a program middle of last year called the Simulator Common Architecture Requirements and Standards Program, or SCARS, worth just shy of $1 billion. CAE is a major subcontractor on that program, and that is working over the next 10 years to increase the concept of bringing together yet more simulators. To do that, as I say, you've got to have common standards. It's been recognized, as I say, for many years. They are very slow in being developed, mainly because of proprietary interests of the companies in the simulation and training industry. But there are some bright areas. For instance, NATO, on the ground, we're talking about live ground training now, tactical engagement simulation systems. A group within NATO called UCAT have developed a common standard for laser-based tactical engagement simulators to work together. And that's been incredibly successful. It's being pushed heavily by Saab training systems from Husqvarna in Sweden. Most recently, the French are also looking at not just common standards for training and simulation, but common standards throughout their three armed forces. And they formed a defense digital agency in late 2020 to look at these standards. And although training and simulation was not mentioned in that initial document, I'm sure it won't be too long before they specify how their armed forces should train together with common digital standards.
So the industry is in the process of building up this architecture. Is that correct? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, as I say, without appearing too cynical, more skeptical, I think I want to appear, and that is they've been doing it for decades, but they haven't actually come to any standard. It's a massive problem, because if you think of all the legacy simulators that are out there, for instance, off the top of my head, if you look at the US Air Force, they've got KC-135 Stratotanker simulators, which have been in service for decades. They've got F-35 simulators, which they've had for a couple of years. Clearly, there's going to be a different standard between those two types of simulators. And they also have, the F-35 has got much more modern image generation systems, display systems, compared to some of the older simulators. Even though the older simulators are upgraded on a regular basis, there's this, mismatch of technologies.
So if you wanted to name 3 reasons why you think that in 40 years they've not been able to achieve what they needed to achieve, what would you say those 3 reasons are?
You're putting me on the spot here. Well, first of all, the proprietary designs and networks provided by the companies themselves. 2, I think the military have got to take a lot of blame for this, for not actually specifying and saying, right, I don't care, we need to do it, and actually be more forceful than they have been over the last few decades. And thirdly, I would say that it's often very difficult for industry. We talked about this proprietary thing, but it's often difficult for industry to talk unless there is a body which makes them discuss things. And when they discuss things, you find that we're forgetting about the proprietary thing now, but you realize that industry have got different technological approaches to solving the same problem. So proprietary, the need for the military to take a lead, and technological differences. Those would be my 3.
Thank you. And I'm just going to put you on the spot one more time. What do you expect to see in 2021 versus what do you think you will see in 2021 happening in the military and training industry?
I do believe that there are new technologies. We talked a lot about AI, but I think there needs to be, it's not just about technologies, it's about the intellectual ability to use those technologies to improve training. And if you look at intellectual abilities to do it, primarily To enable that, you need a cultural shift in the way that we talk about training. You see, nothing is really new. And I look at the T6 pilots going straight to the F-35. Now, okay, different technologies. But during the Second World War, the Royal Air Force were doing exactly the same, taking people off Tiger Moth biplanes and putting them straight onto Blenheim light bombers. They did a study of that. Now, I know people are laughing at me now, saying, well, there's no comparison between a T6 and a F-35 when you compare a Tiger Moth biplane with a Blenheim twin-engine light bomber. But there is, because back then, that was still the same technological leap that we've got today. And so the T6 thing, although very exciting and it's drawn lots of comments from people, it's not really new. So we need more intellectual focus, cultural shift to look at how we can train better. One of the exciting things, I think, is this new PT 2.5. I think that's a great area. Do we need all these massive weapons tactics trainers? Should we be looking at smaller, lower cost, reconfigurable training systems to get our pilots through that training pipeline a lot quicker?
Probably. We'll be looking at that cultural shift. Thank you, Trevor. For our listeners, if you would like to find out more about our military training coverage, you can do so by visiting our website, shepherdmedia.com/news, or by reading our publications dedicated to military training by downloading the Shepherd Media app on your smartphone, available on App Store and Google Play. That's all from me and Trevor today. Until next time, thanks for listening.
It's not that we can't hit the targets we want to hit, it's that we can't hit enough of them with the missiles and the launch platforms that we can get close enough, or that we can afford.
Another worry I have is it's the kind of Kodak moment with missiles, is at what point does the paradigm shift kick in? At what point have you reached the end of the road with missiles? And at what point do you need to start investing in other technologies?
The global threat landscape is changing, but the UK isn't standing still. In November, the government pledged an extra £16.5 billion for military investment over the next 4 years. This money is aimed at modernising the armed forces, helping them to adapt to a new strategic reality. A range of new or rapidly developing complex weapon technologies have come into focus in recent years for the UK and its NATO allies. But what exactly is driving these shifting equipment priorities?
To develop a credible either ballistic missile or hypersonic missile defence system there would cost in the billions of pounds, which we just don't have in the UK, that it's got to be as a collaborative effort.
Welcome to the Defining the Future podcast, Shephard Studios' series on aerospace and defence innovation, sponsored by our partner Raytheon UK. Over the course of 4 episodes, we will tell the story of how innovation, fostered by industry, is helping the UK step out of the shadow of Brexit and the COVID-19 pandemic. We will hear how emerging technologies are supporting the prosperity agenda developed by the government to accelerate Britain's growth in these uncertain times. And we will hear from representatives across industry about how transformation and cutting-edge technologies designed for the military are beginning to reshape the commercial sector. To learn more about efforts underway to deliver the complex weapons of the future, listen to the Defining the Future podcast, available now wherever you get your podcasts.
You have been listening to episode 52, the last one for the second series of the Weekly Defence podcast. We will be back with the first episode of season 3 on Friday the 8th of January. For our listeners, make sure you like and subscribe, leave a review on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcast. From me and the rest of the team here at Shephard, we wish you a wonderful and happy first week of 2021. Until next time, thanks for listening.